The high desert wind carried the scent of sage and dust across the Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training Center, a vast expanse of California wilderness where the earth met sky in a shimmer of heat and distance. It was the kind of place that swallowed sound, where a man could stand at the edge of the world and hear nothing but the whisper of his own mortality. The sun hung merciless overhead, bleaching the landscape into shades of bone and shadow. Lieutenant Evelyn Hargrove stepped out of the government shuttle, her boots touching down on ground that had broken stronger people than her. She was small, not delicate in the way of porcelain, but compact, economical, like a folding knife that fit perfectly in a pocket. 5'2" in her combat boots, 120 pounds soaking wet. Her uniform hung on a frame that looked like it belonged behind a desk, not behind a rifle. She moved with a quietness that was deliberate, practiced, the kind of silence that came from years of making herself invisible. Her face was unremarkable in the way that made people forget her the moment she left a room. Brown hair pulled back in a regulation bun, no makeup. Eyes the color of winter fog that rarely met anyone else's directly. She looked to the casual observer like someone's younger sister who had wandered onto a military base by mistake. The other trainees were already there, a cluster of 15 young Marines who had earned their way into this elite qualification course through sweat and steel. They were the best their units had to offer. Tall men, most of them, with shoulders that filled doorways and hands that could crush beer cans without effort. Their uniforms were crisp, their weapons maintained with religious devotion, their confidence as thick as the dust beneath their feet. They noticed her immediately. How could they not? She was the only woman, the only person who looked like a strong wind might carry her away. The laughter started as a ripple, then grew into something meaner. "Hey, did someone call for a USO show?" one of them called out. "Entertainment office is on the other side of the base, sweetheart." More laughter, sharp, nervous, the kind of sound men make when they're trying to establish a pecking order. Evelyn said nothing. She moved to the equipment station, her movements economical and precise. From a weathered rifle case, she withdrew her weapon, an M110 semi-automatic sniper system. The rifle was old, its finish worn in places where hands had gripped it for thousands of hours. It was not the newest model. It was not the most advanced, but it had been maintained with a devotion that bordered on religious. If anyone had looked closely, really looked, they would have seen something etched into the stock. Tiny marks, 51 of them, each no bigger than a grain of rice, carved with the tip of a knife blade. But no one looked closely. They saw what they expected to see, a woman out of her depth. Gunnery Sergeant Garrett Thorne emerged from the instructor's building like a storm system gathering on the horizon. He was 39 years old and looked like he had been carved from the same red rock that surrounded them. 6'3", 240 pounds. His face was all hard angles and sun damage, his eyes the pale blue of a gas flame. He had spent 15 years in the Marine Corps, 12 of them as a sniper instructor, and he wore his authority like body armor. He stopped when he saw Evelyn. His expression shifted from neutral to something approaching amusement. "Look what we have here," he said, his voice carrying across the range with the ease of someone used to being heard. "Gentlemen, it appears command has sent us a diversity checkbox." The trainees laughed again, emboldened by their instructor's tone. Thorne walked a slow circle around Evelyn, his boots crunching gravel. She stood at attention, eyes forward, spine straight. She was so still she might have been carved from stone. "What's your name, Lieutenant?" Thorne asked, stopping in front of her. "Hargrove, sir. Evelyn Hargrove." Her voice was quiet, not weak, quiet. There was a difference, though most men never learned it. "Hargrove," Thorne repeated, tasting the name. "Let me guess, admin officer? Logistics? Someone at division thought it would be good optics to send a woman through the course, get some photos for the recruiting materials?" "No, sir." "No, sir," Thorne mimicked. Well, Lieutenant Hargrove, this is the Marine Scout Sniper Qualification Course, the hardest marksmanship training in the United States military. Men twice your size have washed out in the first week. Men who could bench press you without breaking a sweat. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to something almost conversational. The recoil from that rifle would break your collarbone. The math required for long-range ballistics would make your head spin. And the physical demands of this course would put you in the medical tent before sunset. So I'm going to do you a favor. I'm going to assign you to observer status. You can watch, take notes, tell your friends you tried. No harm, no foul. Evelyn met his eyes for the first time. Hers were calm, unnervingly calm. The kind of calm that came from seeing things that rewrote the definition of fear. I'd prefer to participate fully, sir. Thorne's smile was cold. I'm sure you would, Princess, but this isn't about what you prefer. This is about maintaining standards. I won't have someone get hurt on my range because we lowered the bar for political correctness. He turned to address the group. All right, listen up. This is week 1, day 1 of an 8-week course that will test every aspect of your capability as a marksman and as a Marine. 50% of you will not finish. The Ghost Shot Challenge at the end of this week will eliminate half of those who remain. By the time we're done, only the best will earn the designation of Scout Sniper. He gestured to the distant mountains, where heat waves made the landscape dance and shimmer. Out there, at 1,800 meters, is a man-sized steel target. 4 Marines in the history of this corps have ever hit that target on their first attempt. It's called the Ghost Shot because most people never even see where their bullet goes. The wind out here is chaos. The mirage is a liar. And the math is unforgiving. The trainees shifted, their earlier confidence tempered by the reality of what lay ahead. Thorne continued, his voice building like a sermon. Before we get to that, we start with fundamentals. Tomorrow morning, 0500, we begin with cold bore shots at 800 meters. A cold bore shot is the truest test of your understanding of your weapon system. The first bullet from a clean, cold barrel flies differently than every shot after. Only a master knows where it will land. He turned back to Evelyn. Lieutenant Hargrove here will be observing, taking notes, learning what real snipers look like. Evelyn said nothing. She simply nodded once, then moved to begin setting up her gear. In the observation tower 200 meters away, General Marcus Webb lowered his binoculars and frowned. He was 68 years old, a 4-star general who had seen combat in 3 different decades and commanded forces across 4 continents. He had the kind of instincts that came from spending a lifetime reading terrain, weather, and men. Something about the small lieutenant bothered him. Not bothered in the sense of concern, but bothered in the sense of recognition. The way she moved, the way she handled her equipment. There was a fluency there that couldn't be taught in a classroom. He picked up his radio. Sergeant Davies, pull up the personnel file for Lieutenant Evelyn Hargrove. I want her full service record on my desk in 10 minutes. Yes, sir, came the immediate response. Webb returned his attention to the range below. The woman, Hargrove, was assembling her rifle with movements that were almost hypnotic in their precision. No fumbling, no hesitation. Her hands knew the weapon the way a pianist knew keys. Interesting. The afternoon sun slanted lower, painting the desert in shades of copper and shadow. The trainees spread out across the range, each claiming a firing position, each trying to project an air of professional competence while their nerves sang beneath their skin. Corporal Marcus Briggs, 25 years old and the top graduate from his infantry training battalion, found himself positioned near Evelyn. He was a big man, farm-raised in Iowa, with hands like slabs of beef and a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts. He had been one of the loudest laughers earlier, feeding off the group's energy, but now, up close, he found himself watching her. She had laid out her equipment with the precision of a surgical table. Everything had its place. Her data book, a worn leather notebook, sat at her right hand. Her wind meter, an analog kestrel unit that looked older than she was, rested beside it. No ballistic computer, no tablet, no modern conveniences that the rest of them took for granted. "Ma'am," he said, his voice lower than before, almost apologetic. You need any help setting up?" Evelyn glanced at him. Her expression was unreadable. "No thank you, Corporal." "It's Briggs, Marcus Briggs." He shifted his weight. "Look, don't take what happened earlier personally. The guys, they just—" "I don't," she said quietly, "take it personally." She returned her attention to her rifle, running a bore snake through the barrel with practiced efficiency. Briggs watched her for another moment, then shook his head and moved back to his own position. There was something off about her. Not wrong, just off. Like a puzzle piece that didn't fit where you expected it to, but fit perfectly somewhere else. The day ended without incident. Thorne dismissed them with instructions to be on the range at 0500 the next morning, rested and ready. The trainees dispersed toward their barracks, their conversation a mixture of bravado and anxiety. Evelyn was the last to leave. She cleaned her rifle in the fading light, her movements meditative. When she finally packed her equipment and stood, the desert was painted in shades of purple and gold, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She walked alone back to her quarters, a small room in the junior officer housing that smelled of disinfectant and old carpet. On the wall above her bunk hung a single photograph, two people in desert camouflage, their arms around each other's shoulders, squinting into harsh sunlight. The man was maybe 30, built like a wrestler, with a broad smile and eyes that crinkled at the corners. The woman was younger, leaner, her expression more serious, but her posture relaxed in a way she never allowed in public. Sergeant Marcus Reed, her spotter, her partner, her friend, dead 3 years now in Kabul. An IED that should have killed them both. He had thrown himself between her and the blast, his body becoming a shield that saved her life and ended his. She looked at the photo for a long moment, then turned away and began to prepare for tomorrow. Morning came cold and sharp, the desert trading its furnace heat for a chill that sank into bones. The trainees assembled on the range as the sky lightened from black to deep blue to the pale wash of dawn. They moved with the stiffness of men who had slept poorly, their nerves keeping them in that shallow place between rest and waking. Thorne was already there, of course, looking as fresh as if he had slept in a five-star hotel. He stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, as the trainees formed up. "Cold bore test," he announced without preamble. 800 meters, you get one shot. One. This is not about grouping. This is not about adjustment. This is about knowing your weapon so completely that you can predict exactly where that first cold bullet will strike. He gestured to the distant target, a steel silhouette that looked impossibly small against the vast backdrop of mountain and sky. The wind is blowing 12 to 15 miles per hour from the northwest. Temperature is 42 degrees and rising. Humidity is 15%. Your ballistic computers will give you a solution. Whether you trust it is up to you. The first shooter took position. His name was Lance Corporal Davidson, a man from Georgia with a sniper qualification from infantry school and a chip on his shoulder the size of a cinder block. He consulted his ballistic computer, made his adjustments, and settled into his firing position. The shot rang out, a sharp crack that echoed off the distant ridgeline. Everyone watched the target through spotting scopes. Dust puff. 3 feet left, 2 feet low. "Miss," Thorne called out. "Next." The second shooter fared no better. 2 feet right, 1 foot high. The third shot missed by even more. Thorne's expression never changed, but there was something in his eyes that looked almost satisfied. He was building a narrative. This is impossible. This is hard. This is why only the best make it. "Lieutenant Hargrove," he called out. Evelyn stood. She had been sitting cross-legged on her shooting mat, her rifle across her lap, watching the others. She moved to the firing line without hurry. You sure you want to do this? Thorne asked, his voice carrying just enough volume for everyone to hear. That rifle kicks like an angry mule. I'd hate for you to end up in medical on day 2. I'm sure, sir. She knelt behind her rifle, settling into the prone position with a grace that made the movement look effortless. But she didn't immediately put her eye to the scope. Instead, she produced her wind meter, held it up, and watched the impeller spin. She wasn't looking at the digital readout. She was feeling the wind, reading it with senses that went beyond numbers. Then she opened her data book. The pages were filled with dense columns of handwritten notes, numbers, observations, weather conditions cross-referenced with ammunition lots and temperature variations. It was the accumulated wisdom of thousands of hours behind a rifle, distilled into cramped handwriting that only she could decipher. "What's that?" one of the trainees whispered. "Her recipe book?" Laughter. Nervous, uncertain laughter. Evelyn ignored it. She made a minute adjustment to her elevation turret. Click. Then another adjustment to her windage. Click, click. The movements were so small they were almost invisible, but they were made with absolute certainty. She settled into the rifle, her breathing slowing until it was barely perceptible. The world narrowed. The jokes faded. The watching men disappeared. There was only the reticle, the target, and the space between them. Thorne stood over her, waiting for the mistake, waiting for the excuse to pull her off the line and send her packing. The rifle barked. The recoil drove back into her shoulder with 40 foot-pounds of energy, but she absorbed it like water absorbing a stone, her body flowing with the force rather than fighting it. Through the spotting scopes, 15 sets of eyes watched the target. Center mass. Perfect. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunshot. Thorne's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Wind call," he said, his voice flat. "Lucky read." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't luck. You didn't get lucky with a cold-bore shot at 800 meters in a shifting crosswind. You got skilled. Evelyn stood, her expression unchanged, and returned to her mat to clean her rifle. She didn't celebrate. She didn't even look at the others. She simply began her post-shot ritual, running a cleaning patch through the barrel, checking the bolt face, noting the ambient temperature in her data book. Briggs, watching from his position, felt something shift in his perception. The jokes from yesterday suddenly felt hollow, mean-spirited in a way that made him uncomfortable. In the observation tower, General Webb's aide approached with a tablet. "Sir, that personnel file you requested." Webb took the device, his eyes scanning the screen. What he saw made him sit up straighter. "Classified," he muttered. "Why is half her record classified?" He scrolled further. What wasn't classified was impressive enough. Distinguished marksman badges, rifle expert qualification, graduate of Scout Sniper School, deployment to Iraq, deployment to Afghanistan. But there were gaps, large black rectangles where information should have been, redacted sections that required clearances even he didn't have immediate access to. He picked up his radio. "This is General Webb. I need a classification override on personnel file Charlie Hotel 7732. Route it through JSOC if necessary. I want full disclosure by end of day." Sir, that might take end of day, Sergeant." "Yes, sir." Webb returned his attention to the range. The small lieutenant was now sitting quietly, her rifle across her lap, watching the other trainees take their shots. She looked like someone waiting for a bus, patient, unbothered, entirely out of place and yet somehow completely at home. The morning wore on, the sun climbed higher, burning away the chill and replacing it with the familiar desert heat. More trainees took their cold bore shots. The success rate remained dismal. Only 2 others managed hits, and neither was as clean as Evelyn's. At 10:00, Thorne called for a break. The trainees dispersed to refill water bottles and find shade where they could. The desert offered little mercy, but the equipment sheds provided at least some relief from the direct sun. Evelyn remained on her mat. She didn't seek shade. She didn't socialize. She sat with her rifle and her data book, making notes with the stub of a mechanical pencil. Thorne approached her, his shadow falling across her work. "That was a decent shot this morning, Lieutenant," he said. His tone was carefully neutral, but there was an edge beneath it. "Beginner's luck has a way of running out, though." Evelyn looked up at him. Her gray eyes were calm. "Yes, sir. You understand the standards here, right? This isn't infantry school. This isn't basic marksmanship. We're building precision instruments. Marines who can reach out and touch someone at distances that would make a normal rifleman weep." "I understand, sir." Thorne crouched down, bringing himself closer to her eye level. It was meant to be conversational, almost friendly, but there was something predatory in the movement. "Between you and me, I don't think you belong here. I think someone at Division made a decision based on politics rather than capability. But I'm a fair man. I'll give you every opportunity to prove me wrong." He paused. "Or prove me right." "I appreciate that, sir." He stood, his knees cracking slightly. "This afternoon, classroom instruction, ballistics, atmospheric effects, the Coriolis effect. Math gets complicated. Hope you brought your calculator." He walked away before she could respond. Briggs, who had been close enough to overhear, shook his head. He moved over to Evelyn's position, squatting down on his heels. "He's testing you," Briggs said quietly, "trying to get in your head." "I know. For what it's worth, that shot this morning was impressive. I've seen guys with years of experience miss that shot." Evelyn glanced at him, then back to her data book. "Thank you, Corporal." "Briggs. Call me Briggs." He scratched his jaw. "Look, I wanted to apologize for yesterday. The jokes and all that. It wasn't right." "It's fine." "No, it's not. My mama would slap me sideways if she heard me talking to a woman like that. Military or not." He stood. "Anyway, if you need anything, let me know." He walked away, leaving Evelyn alone with her rifle and her thoughts. The afternoon classroom session was held in a cinder-block building that had all the charm of a prison cell. Metal folding chairs, a whiteboard at the front, a lectern. The air conditioning worked, barely, pushing tepid air through vents that rattled with every cycle. Thorne stood at the front, a pointer in his hand, a series of complex equations written on the board behind him. "Long-range shooting is applied physics," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who had given this lecture 100 times. "Every shot you take is influenced by dozens of variables: wind speed and direction, air temperature and density, humidity, the rotation of the Earth itself." He tapped the board with his pointer. "The Coriolis effect. Most shooters never have to worry about it because they're not shooting far enough. But at the distances we engage, the rotation of the Earth will push your bullet off course. In the Northern Hemisphere, that deflection is to the right. The formula is complex, but the principle is simple. You must account for the fact that your target is moving, even when it's standing still." He went on, building the lecture like a wall, brick by brick. Muzzle velocity, ballistic coefficients, transonic destabilization, spin drift, the Magnus effect. The trainees took notes, their faces showing varying degrees of comprehension and confusion. Evelyn sat in the back, her notebook open, her pencil moving, but she wasn't transcribing his lecture word for word. She was doing something else, working through calculations, checking his math, and finding errors. Thorne had written a formula for calculating wind deflection at extreme range. It was close, but it wasn't right. He had used a simplified version that worked for most conditions, but failed to account for vertical wind components in mountainous terrain. She circled the error in her notebook, then wrote the correct formula beneath it. "Questions?" Thorne asked, turning to face the class. No one spoke. "Good, then you're all following." His eyes landed on Evelyn. "Lieutenant Hargrove, you're being awfully quiet back there. This all making sense?" "Yes, sir." "Ballistic coefficients. Can you explain what a G7 drag model is and when you'd use it over a G1? It was a gotcha question, technical. Esoteric, the kind of thing most people forgot 5 minutes after learning it. Evelyn's voice was quiet but steady. A G7 drag model is designed for long, sleek, boat-tail bullets, more accurate than G1 for modern match ammunition at extended ranges because it better represents the bullet's actual drag profile through transonic and subsonic flight. Thorne's expression didn't change. And the formula for calculating spin drift? Drift equals the time of flight squared, multiplied by the spin rate, adjusted for gyroscopic stability factor. For a right-hand twist, drift is right. Magnitude increases exponentially with distance. A pause. The other trainees shifted in their seats, suddenly aware that this quiet woman in the back might know more than any of them. Thorne turned back to the board, his shoulders tense. "That's correct," he said, his voice clipped. He continued the lecture, but there was a new energy in the room now, an unspoken question that hung in the air like smoke. Who was she? The lecture ended. The trainees filed out, blinking in the harsh afternoon sunlight. Thorne remained behind, staring at the board, his jaw working. Evelyn was the last to leave. As she passed the lectern, Thorne spoke without looking at her. "You've studied this before." It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "More than studied, you've used it." She paused at the door. "Yes, sir." Thorne finally turned to look at her. His pale blue eyes were searching, trying to find the angle, trying to understand what he was dealing with. "This isn't a game, Lieutenant. I don't know what strings got pulled to get you here, but this course breaks people. Strong people. People who have spent their entire lives preparing for this." "I know, sir." "Do you?" He stepped closer. "Because from where I'm standing, you're a political statement, a photo op waiting to happen. And when you wash out, not if, when, it'll set back every woman who legitimately wants to serve in this capacity." Evelyn met his eyes. There was no anger in her expression, no defiance, just that same unnerving calm. "I won't wash out, sir." "We'll see." She left him standing there, alone in the empty classroom, his certainty shaken in a way he would never admit out loud. That evening, as the sun bled red across the western horizon, Thorne stood in his office and made a phone call. "I need information on a Lieutenant Evelyn Hargrove, current student in my course. Something's off about her." The voice on the other end was professional, detached. "What kind of information?" "Service record. Real service record, not the sanitized version that came with her orders." "I'll see what I can pull. Might take a few days." "I need it sooner." "I'll do what I can." Thorne ended the call and stood at his window, looking out over the darkening range. Tomorrow was day 3, the ghost shot qualification, the test that would separate pretenders from professionals. He would see then. He would know for certain whether this small, quiet woman was a fluke or something else entirely. In her quarters, Evelyn lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. The photograph of her and Marcus Reed sat on the small table beside her. In the dim light, his smile seemed to carry a message, an encouragement, a challenge. "Make it count, Eve. Make every shot count." She closed her eyes and let her breathing slow, preparing her mind for what was coming. The ghost shot. 1,800 meters of desert wind and atmospheric chaos. A target that had humbled some of the best marksmen in the Marine Corps. She had made longer shots, much longer, but those had been in combat where failure meant death and success meant survival. This was different. This was theater. This was about proving something that shouldn't need proving. But she would prove it anyway. She always did. The third morning arrived with a clarity that made the distant mountains look close enough to touch. The air was still, holding its breath, waiting for the heat that would come later and turn the range into a furnace of mirages in dancing light. It was the kind of morning that snipers either loved or feared, depending on whether they understood that stillness was a lie. General Webb stood in the observation tower with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He had been there since 0430, watching the range come alive in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the trainees arrive one by one, watching Lieutenant Hargrove set up her equipment with the same methodical precision she had shown every day. His aide, Sergeant Davies, approached with a tablet and an expression that suggested complicated news. "Sir, about that personnel file." Webb didn't turn from the window. "What did you find?" "Not much, sir. Most of her recent service history is classified above my clearance level. What I could access shows deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, but the details are redacted. Unit assignments are redacted. Combat action reports are redacted." Davies paused. "Sir, I've never seen a lieutenant's file with this level of classification. Usually you only see this with special operations personnel." Now Webb turned. "Special operations." "Yes, sir, but she's regular Marine Corps. No indication of any special warfare training in her accessible records." Webb took the tablet and scrolled through what little information was visible. Graduate of the basic school, infantry officer course, scout sniper school. Standard progression for a Marine officer with marksmanship aptitude. But then the gaps began. Black rectangles, redacted paragraphs, entire pages that required clearances that took days to obtain. "Keep working on it," Webb said. "Go through MARSOC if you have to. I want to know who that woman is before the end of this week." "Yes, sir." Webb returned his attention to the range. Far below, Gunnery Sergeant Thorne was assembling the trainees, his voice carrying faintly on the still morning air. The ghost shot qualification. Webb had seen dozens of these over the years, had seen men who looked unbeatable crumble when faced with that particular challenge, had seen unlikely candidates pull off impossible shots that became legend. Something in his gut told him today would be the latter. Thorne stood before his students with the bearing of a man who held all the cards. He wore his authority like a second skin, comfortable and unquestioned. The trainees stood in a rough semicircle, their faces showing the strain of 3 days of intensive training, 3 days of being pushed to their limits and occasionally beyond. "The ghost shot," Thorne began, his voice carrying the weight of ritual. 1,800 meters, 1.1 miles. At this distance, you're not just fighting wind and gravity, you're fighting the curvature of the Earth itself. You're fighting air density that changes by the second. You're fighting every assumption you've ever made about what a rifle can do. He paused, letting his words settle. "This target has been on this range for 15 years. In that time, 4 Marines have hit it on their qualification attempt. 4. Out of hundreds who have tried. The average miss distance is 20 feet. 20 feet at over a mile. That's how precise you have to be." He turned and gestured toward the distant ridgeline, where a small steel silhouette was barely visible, even with the naked eye. "The wind you feel here at the firing line is not the wind that bullet will encounter downrange. Out there, the air moves in layers, in vortexes, in patterns that change moment to moment. The mirage you see through your scope will lie to you. The heat rising from the earth will bend light and make you second-guess every calculation." Thorne's pale blue eyes swept across the group. "This shot is designed to separate those who can shoot from those who can truly read the environment. Technology will help you. Ballistic computers will give you solutions. But the computer doesn't know what the wind is doing at meter 1200. The computer doesn't understand how that rock formation at meter 900 creates an eddy that will push your bullet 3 feet to the left." He let the silence build. "Only experience knows that. Only time behind the rifle, watching the wind, reading the mirage, understanding the dance between bullet and air. That's what makes a sniper. Not the technology, the understanding." Lance Corporal Davidson raised his hand. "Sir, what's the record for this shot?" Thorne allowed himself a small smile. "The course record is held by a Marine who completed this qualification in 2009. First shot hit. Time from setup to trigger pull was 4 minutes. That Marine is now a sergeant major somewhere in Okinawa, and his name is on a plaque in the armory." "Do we get multiple attempts, sir?" "You get as many attempts as I decide to give you. But understand this, every miss tells me something about your capability, your judgment, your understanding of the craft. I'm not looking for lucky hits. I'm looking for Marines who know what they're doing. Thorne pulled out a roster. We'll go in alphabetical order. Briggs, you're up first. Corporal Briggs felt his stomach drop. He had been hoping to watch a few others first, to get a sense of how the wind was playing, to learn from their mistakes. But there would be no warm-up, no practice run. He moved to the firing line, his M110 feeling heavier than usual. His ballistic computer was already calculating, numbers scrolling across the small screen. Wind speed, temperature, barometric pressure. It gave him a solution. 12.3 mils elevation, 2.7 mils right windage. He dialed in the adjustments, settled into his prone position, and tried to steady his breathing. Through the scope, the target swam in a soup of heat mirage. The crosshairs danced. His heart hammered against the earth. He waited for the wind to calm, for a pocket of stillness that never quite came. Finally, he pressed the trigger. The shot broke clean. The recoil drove back. Through spotting scopes, 15 pairs of eyes watched the impact. Dust puff. 8 feet left, 4 feet low. Miss, Thorne called out. Next. One by one, the trainees took their turns. Each approached the firing line with confidence that eroded with every passing second behind the rifle. The target mocked them with its distance, with its refusal to be hit. Davidson missed by 12 feet, Corporal Thompson by 15, Private First Class Wilson by 6, the closest yet, but still a miss that would have meant a dead Marine in combat instead of a dead enemy. Thorne provided commentary after each attempt, his voice a mixture of instruction and subtle condemnation. You're reading the mirage wrong. That boil you see at 800 meters, that's telling you the wind is stronger than your meter says. You rush the shot. At this distance, rushing means missing. Patience is the difference between life and death. Your natural point of aim was off. You were muscling the rifle onto target. The rifle should settle naturally, or you'll never be consistent. The morning wore on. The sun climbed higher. The temperature rose from comfortable to hot to oppressive. The trainees sweated through their uniforms. The wind, which had been calm at dawn, began to gust and swirl, adding chaos to an already impossible equation. By the time Thorne called her name, 10 shooters had attempted the shot. Not one had connected. Lieutenant Hargrove, you're up. Evelyn stood. She had been sitting cross-legged on her mat, watching each attempt with the focus of someone studying a foreign language. She had made no notes, hadn't consulted any data, had simply watched the wind, watched the mirage, watched the way each bullet betrayed its path through the disturbed air downrange. She moved to the firing line without hurry. No wasted motion, no excess energy spent on anything that didn't contribute to the shot. Thorne stood over her, arms crossed. Same rules apply, Lieutenant. Take your time. Don't hurt yourself. The condescension in his voice was subtle but present, a reminder that he still saw her as an outsider, a pretender. Evelyn knelt behind her rifle, settling into the prone position with a fluidity that made the movement look choreographed. She didn't immediately look through the scope. Instead, she produced her wind meter, that ancient kestrel unit with its worn plastic housing and faded display. She held it up, not looking at the numbers, but watching the impeller spin, feeling the wind on her face, reading the sagebrush 60 meters downrange, watching how it bent and swayed, looking beyond the immediate environment to the middle distances, where dust devils occasionally formed and dissipated, invisible signatures of wind patterns that would affect her bullet's flight. Any time now, Lieutenant, Thorne said. We don't have all day. Evelyn ignored him. She opened her data book, those pages filled with cramped handwriting that represented thousands of hours of accumulated knowledge. Her finger traced down a column, found what she was looking for, made a small notation. The other trainees watched with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. She was using old equipment, ancient methods, no computer, no modern aids. In an age where technology provided solutions at the touch of a button, she was doing it the way Marines had done it 40 years ago. She made her elevation adjustment. Click, click, click. 12 clicks up, then windage. Click, 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 click. 5 clicks right, but then she paused, felt the wind shift slightly, and added one more click. 6 clicks right. Holding into the wind more than any of the previous shooters, she settled into the rifle, her body becoming part of the weapon system. The buttstock fit perfectly into her shoulder pocket, molded by repetition. Her cheek found its natural place on the cheek rest. Her eye found the scope at exactly the right distance, the full sight picture clear and bright. Through the reticle, the target was a shimmer, a ghost indeed, dancing in heat waves that rose from the scorched earth. The mirage made it look like it was underwater, distorted and unreliable. But Evelyn didn't look at the target. She looked at the vegetation behind it. Sparse as it was, there were scattered patches of desert grass and sage. She watched how they moved. They told her what the mirage wouldn't, the truth of the wind at that specific location. Her breathing slowed, became rhythmic, mechanical. 5 seconds in through the nose, 3-second hold, 7 seconds out through the mouth, again and again. Her heart rate, which had been elevated from the walk to the firing line, began to drop. 70 beats per minute, 65, 60. The world narrowed to the size of the reticle. Everything else, the watching men, the harsh sun, the voice of doubt that lived in every shooter's mind, faded into a gray nothing. She wasn't aiming at where the target was. She was aiming at where it would be in the 3.4 seconds it would take the bullet to travel 1,800 meters. She was aiming at a point in space and time that didn't exist yet, trusting mathematics and experience and instinct to converge in a single moment of perfect execution. The trigger press was not an event. It was a process. Steady pressure, increasing, increasing. The rifle would tell her when it was ready. The trigger would break when it was supposed to. A surprise that wasn't a surprise. A moment that she created but didn't force. The shot broke. The rifle recoiled. The muzzle climbed. The cartridge ejected in a brass arc that caught the sunlight. And then, silence. That terrible, wonderful silence that exists in the space between cause and effect. The bullet was in flight, an invisible messenger carrying her will across desert air, through heat and wind and the random chaos of atmospheric conditions. 3 seconds felt like 3 hours. Thorne had his spotting scope trained on the target, his face showing nothing but professional attention. The other trainees watched through their own optics, hardly daring to breathe. Then, impossibly, a sound drifted back across the vast distance. A metallic ring, sharp and clear and unmistakable. Tink! The sound of hardened steel meeting copper-jacketed lead at over a mile away. The sound of precision made manifest. The trainees stared. Thorne's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Through the spotting scopes, they could see the fresh impact crater, dead center on the steel silhouette. The silence that followed was profound. It was the silence of assumptions being shattered, of certainties being called into question, of a natural order being disrupted. Evelyn remained in position for a moment longer, watching her sight picture, confirming the hit through her own scope. Then she began her post-shot ritual, ejecting the magazine, clearing the chamber, running a bore snake through the barrel, each movement precise and practiced, as if the impossible shot she had just made was simply another task to be completed and set aside. Thorne found his voice first. "Lucky," he said, but the word came out wrong, hollow. "Lucky wind call. Lucky read on the mirage." He turned to face the group, his expression hardening into something defensive. "One shot proves nothing. Even a blind squirrel finds a nut occasionally. This could have been a fluke, a 1 in 1,000 chance where everything aligned." But even as he said it, he could feel the ground shifting beneath him. The trainees were looking at Evelyn differently now. The casual dismissal, the easy mockery, it was draining away, replaced by something that looked like respect. Or perhaps fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of being wrong. Briggs, still smarting from his own miss, couldn't help but speak up. "Sir, with respect, that didn't look like luck. That looked like she knew exactly what she was doing." Thorne's pale eyes fixed on him. "Did I ask for your assessment, Corporal?" "No, sir, but—" "Then keep it to yourself." Thorne turned back to Evelyn, who was now cleaning her rifle with the same methodical attention she gave everything. She hadn't celebrated, hadn't even smiled. It was as if hitting an impossible target at over a mile was simply what she did. Expected, routine. "Lieutenant Hargrove," Thorne said, his voice taking on a formal edge. "That shot is under review. We need to verify the target systems are functioning correctly before any official qualification can be recorded." Evelyn looked up at him, her gray eyes calm. "I understand, sir. Furthermore, there are questions about procedural compliance. I need to review the range safety protocols before—" "Gunnery Sergeant Thorne," the voice came from behind them, carrying the kind of authority that made everyone snap to attention without thinking. General Webb was descending from the observation tower, his stride purposeful, his face unreadable. Thorne turned, his back straightening. "Sir." Webb walked past the assembled trainees without acknowledging them, his focus entirely on Thorne. When he reached the instructor, he stopped, arms crossed. "The target systems are functioning perfectly, Gunny. I had them calibrated myself 2 days ago. And unless you've recently added telepathy to your skill set, I suggest you stop trying to explain away what we all just witnessed." "Sir, I was simply noting that you were trying to invalidate a perfect shot because it doesn't fit your preconceptions." Webb's voice was quiet, but carried an edge that could cut steel. "I've seen a lot of shooting in my career, Gunny. That wasn't luck. That was mastery." Thorne's face flushed slightly, but he held his ground. "Sir, with all due respect, one shot that 10 other Marines just failed to make. One shot that required reading wind conditions I'm not sure you could read. One shot that this lieutenant made look easy." Webb paused. "Pull up her personnel file." "Sir, I don't have—" "Pull it up now, Gunny. On your tablet. Let's see what we're dealing with." Thorne's hands moved to his ruggedized tablet with visible reluctance. He tapped the screen, navigating to the personnel database. Typed in Evelyn's name. Waited for the file to load. What appeared on the screen made his face go pale. The file was sparse. Most of the relevant sections were blocked by black rectangles and warnings about classification levels. But what was visible was enough to make his world tilt on its axis. Unit designation, redacted. Primary MOS, redacted. Secondary MOS, 0317. Scout Sniper. Deployments, Iraq 2019 to 2020, Afghanistan 2021 to 2022, redacted. Redacted. Combat Action Reports, classified. Awards, Bronze Star with Valor Device, 2. Purple Heart, Navy Commendation Medal with Valor Device, redacted. Redacted. Confirmed Enemy KIA, redacted. Longest Recorded Engagement, redacted. Technical Publications authored, Advanced Urban Sniper Tactics, 2023, classified. Conclusion to Marine Corps Scout Sniper Manual, 2024 edition. Chapter 8, Special Qualifications, redacted, redacted. High-Angle Urban Engagement Specialist, redacted. Thorne stared at the screen. His mouth opened, closed. The words wouldn't come. General Webb took the tablet from his hands and held it up for the trainees to see, though the redacted sections made most of it unreadable. "Lieutenant Evelyn Hargrove," Webb said, his voice carrying across the range, "graduate of Scout Sniper School, class of 2020, deployed to Mosul, Iraq, where she served as a sniper in urban combat operations. Deployed to Kabul and Kandahar, Afghanistan, where she engaged in counterinsurgency operations. He paused, letting the information sink in. Those redacted sections? Those are classified because they involve special operations that are still active or sensitive. But I can tell you what's been declassified. Lieutenant Hargrove has over 50 confirmed combat eliminations. 50. She holds 2 Bronze Stars for actions in combat. One of those was awarded after she single-handedly held off an insurgent assault on a firebase by eliminating an RPG team at 1,600 meters, saving the lives of 23 Marines who would have been overrun. The trainees stood in stunned silence. Evelyn remained kneeling beside her rifle, her expression unchanged, as if her service record was being read aloud every day. Webb continued, his voice taking on an edge that made Thorne visibly uncomfortable. Chapter 8 of the Marine Corps Scout Sniper Manual, which you've been teaching from, Gunnery Sergeant, the section on urban high-angle engagements, was written based on Lieutenant Hargrove's field data. Her observations, her calculations, her experience. He turned to look directly at Thorne. So when you stood there and lectured her about ballistics, you were teaching her own work back to her. When you questioned her competence, you were questioning one of the most experienced combat snipers currently serving in the Marine Corps. And when you tried to invalidate her shot just now, you were doing it in front of the same officer who helped write the doctrine you're supposed to be teaching. The silence that followed was crushing. Every eye was on Thorne, watching him process information that was systematically destroying his understanding of the past 3 days. Webb wasn't finished. There's one more thing the file doesn't show clearly because it's buried in those redacted sections. Lieutenant Hargrove's spotter, Sergeant Marcus Reed, was killed in action 3 years ago in Kabul. She was wounded in the same engagement, took shrapnel to the left shoulder, refused medical evacuation until her position was secured and enemy forces were neutralized. He glanced at Evelyn, who had finally looked up from her rifle. Her expression showed a flicker of something, pain, perhaps, or memory, before returning to neutral. This qualification course, Webb continued, this is her return to operational status after recovery and therapy. This is her proving to herself and to this Corps that she can still do the job. He turned his attention back to Thorne, and when he spoke again, his voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. So I suggest, Gunnery Sergeant, that you set aside whatever assumptions you brought into this course and recognize that you're in the presence of someone who has more combat experience than most Marines will see in an entire career. And perhaps, just perhaps, you might have something to learn from her. Webb straightened, his formal demeanor returning. He faced Evelyn and brought his hand up in a crisp salute. It was a gesture so unexpected, so unprecedented, that several trainees gasped audibly. A 4-star general did not salute junior officers. Not in training environments, not casually. The salute was reserved for formal occasions, for ceremonies, for moments of profound significance. But Webb held the salute, his hands steady, his eyes locked with Evelyn's. She stood slowly and returned the salute with equal precision. When their hands dropped, Webb nodded once. It's an honor to have you on this range, Lieutenant. An honor and a privilege. Thank you, sir, Evelyn said quietly, the first full sentence she had spoken since the revelation began. Webb turned and walked back toward the observation tower, leaving a range full of men trying to process what had just happened. The confident, mocking atmosphere that had dominated the first 3 days was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that everything they thought they knew was wrong. Thorne stood rooted to the spot, his tablet hanging loose in one hand, his face cycling through expressions too rapidly to track. Shock, embarrassment, anger, confusion. He looked at Evelyn, then at the distant target where her bullet had struck true, then back at his tablet screen with its damning, redacted sections. Dismissed for lunch, he finally managed, his voice hoarse. Be back at 1300 for afternoon session. The trainees dispersed, but slowly, reluctantly, casting glances back at Evelyn as if she might disappear if they looked away. Briggs lingered, clearly wanting to say something, but unable to find the words. Finally, he simply nodded to her and walked away. Evelyn was left alone on the firing line with Thorne. The silence between them stretched taut as a wire. "I didn't know," Thorne said finally. His voice was quiet, stripped of its usual authority. "Your file came through standard channels, light on details. I thought You thought I was a diversity hire," Evelyn said. Not accusing, just stating fact. "Yes," the admission came hard. "I thought someone at Division made a political decision. Thought I was being forced to push through someone who didn't belong here. And now?" Thorne looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time, saw past the small frame and quiet demeanor to something that had been there all along, but he'd been too blind to recognize. "Now I don't know what to think." Evelyn began packing her equipment with the same methodical care she gave everything. "The assumptions we make are often wrong, Gunnery Sergeant. The enemy I've faced didn't care about my size or gender. They cared about whether I could put rounds on target, whether I could do the job." She shouldered her rifle case. "I can do the job." She walked away, leaving Thorne standing alone on the firing line, his certainty shattered, his pride in ruins, forced to confront the reality that his prejudice had blinded him to excellence. The afternoon sun hung like a judgment over the California desert, turning the air into something visible, something that shimmered and bent light into lies. In the shade of the equipment shed, the trainees sat in small groups, their conversation muted, their earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious. The revelation about Lieutenant Hargrove had rewritten the narrative of the course, had transformed what they thought they understood about capability and appearance and the nature of expertise itself. Corporal Briggs sat with his back against the corrugated metal wall, his MRE untouched in his lap. He kept replaying the morning in his mind. The casual mockery, the easy assumptions, the jokes about diversity hires and checkboxes. Every word now felt like a stone he would carry. Private First Class Wilson, 22 years old and fresh from infantry battalion, spoke what several of them were thinking. 50 confirmed kills. She's got more combat experience than our entire platoon combined. More than that, another trainee added. Those redacted sections. You only get that level of classification if you're doing work that's seriously black ops. Special mission units. She's been places we'll never hear about. Briggs finally opened his MRE, more for something to do with his hands than from hunger. We were complete assholes to her. We didn't know, Wilson offered weakly. That's the point, Briggs said, his voice harder than usual. We should have treated her with respect regardless. She's a Marine. She earned her rank. That should have been enough. Across the range, in the instructor's office that was little more than a plywood box with air conditioning, Gunnery Sergeant Thorne sat at his desk and stared at nothing. His tablet lay in front of him, Evelyn's personnel file still displayed, those black redacted sections mocking him with what he couldn't know and what he should have guessed. His phone buzzed, a text message from his contact at division personnel. Couldn't get much more on Hargrove. What's not redacted is impressive enough. Why are you asking? Thorne didn't reply. What would he say? That he had spent 3 days humiliating one of the most experienced combat snipers in the Marine Corps? That he had let his assumptions about gender and capability blind him to obvious signs of professional mastery? He had been teaching for 12 years, had qualified hundreds of Marines, prided himself on his ability to spot natural talent, to recognize potential, to separate those who could make it from those who would wash out. And he had been completely, catastrophically wrong about her. The door opened without a knock. General Webb entered, his presence filling the small space. Thorne stood immediately. Sir. Webb closed the door behind him and gestured for Thorne to sit. The general remained standing, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. I'm not here to relieve you, Gunny, Webb said, though I imagine you're wondering if that's coming. Sir, I'm here to tell you a story. Webb moved to the window, looking out over the range where heat waves turned the distant mountains into watercolors. 26 years ago, I was a captain, Battalion S3. I had a new lieutenant assigned to my unit. Kid was maybe 23, looked like he was 17, thin, wore glasses, had a degree from some state college I'd never heard of. Webb paused, his jaw working. I took one look at him and decided he was going to be a problem. Too bookish, too soft. I put him in charge of motor transport because I figured he couldn't screw that up too badly. Kept him away from anything important. Thorne listened, seeing where this was going. That lieutenant, Webb continued, ended up saving my life in Fallujah. Pulled me out of a burning Humvee after an IED strike. Carried me 200 meters under fire to a casualty collection point. Got a Silver Star for it. Last I heard, he's a colonel commanding a Marine Expeditionary Unit. Webb turned to face Thorne. I learned something that day. The most dangerous assumption on any battlefield is the one you make about your own people. The enemy you can prepare for. The failures in your own judgment, those will kill you every time. Sir, I apologize. Don't apologize to me, Gunny. I'm not the one you spent 3 days dismissing and humiliating. Webb's voice hardened. That lieutenant out there has seen things we can only imagine, has done things that earn redacted files and classified commendations, and you treated her like she was wasting your time. The words landed like physical blows. Thorne felt his face flush. What do you want me to do, sir? I want you to be a better instructor, a better Marine. Webb moved toward the door, then stopped. And I want you to understand something. That woman doesn't need this qualification. Her combat record speaks for itself. She's here because she needs to prove something to herself, to get past whatever demons came home with her from Kabul. Your job is to help her do that, not to tear her down. Webb left without waiting for a response. Thorne sat in the empty office for a long time, the air conditioning humming, the afternoon heat pressing against the thin walls. Finally, he stood, straightened his uniform, and walked out into the harsh sunlight. He had a course to run, Marines to train, and a massive error in judgment to somehow correct. The afternoon session was scheduled for classroom instruction, but Thorne changed the plan. He gathered the trainees on the range, in the shade of a canvas awning that did little to cut the heat, but at least blocked the direct sun. Change of schedule, he announced. We're going to talk about what happened this morning. The trainees shifted uncomfortably. Evelyn sat slightly apart from the group, her expression neutral, her data book open on her lap. Thorne took a breath, squaring his shoulders. I was wrong, he said. The words came hard, dragged up from a place that resisted their speaking. About Lieutenant Hargrove. About what I assumed she was capable of. About why she was here. He looked directly at her. I saw someone who didn't fit my preconception of what a sniper should look like, and I let that blind me to obvious signs of competence. I disrespected a fellow Marine who has more combat experience than most of us will ever accumulate. For that, I apologize. Publicly, without reservation. Evelyn met his eyes but said nothing. Thorne continued, his voice gaining strength. There's a lesson in this for all of you. The enemy doesn't care about your assumptions. They'll exploit every blind spot you create. In combat, underestimation is a bullet you fire at yourself. The deadliest person on any battlefield is often the one you notice least. He gestured toward the distant target, still bearing the mark of Evelyn's shot. That target has humbled dozens of qualified Marines, but Lieutenant Hargrove hit it on her first attempt, using methods most of you dismissed as outdated. Why? Because she understands something fundamental that technology can't teach. She reads the environment, feels the wind, understands the terrain. That knowledge came from experience, from time behind the rifle in conditions where mistakes meant death. Briggs raised his hand. Sir, how do we develop that kind of understanding? You listen, Thorne said. You watch. You learn from people who know more than you do, regardless of whether they fit your mental image of what an expert should be. He turned to Evelyn. "Lieutenant, would you be willing to walk us through your shot this morning? Explain how you read the conditions?" It was a request, not an order, an invitation, an acknowledgement that she had knowledge worth sharing. Evelyn closed her data book and stood. She was silent for a moment, and several trainees wondered if she would decline. But then she spoke, her voice quiet but carrying clearly in the still air. The wind at the firing line was 12 miles per hour from the northwest, but that's not the wind that mattered. At 800 meters, there's a rock formation that creates an eddy. The wind accelerates around it, then creates a dead space immediately behind it. You can see this by watching the dust patterns. She walked to the edge of the awning, pointing toward the distant terrain. At 1,200 meters, the terrain drops into a slight depression. Cooler air settles there. The bullet enters that zone and experiences increased air density, which creates additional drag. You have to account for that, or you'll hit low. The trainees listened with an intensity they hadn't shown in any previous class. Beyond 1,500 meters, the wind becomes more consistent because you're above the terrain features that create turbulence. But the mirage makes it hard to see. So you don't look at the mirage. You look past it, find reference points, vegetation, rocks, anything that shows you what the air is actually doing. She paused, her gray eyes distant, seeing something beyond the physical landscape. The ballistic computer gives you a starting point, but it can't account for the specific conditions of a specific moment on a specific range. That's where experience comes in. Pattern recognition, understanding how temperature gradients affect bullet flight, how terrain shapes wind, how to read signs that most people miss because they're looking at screens instead of Earth. "How long did it take you to develop that understanding?" Wilson asked. "Years," Evelyn said simply. "Thousands of rounds, hundreds of hours watching wind, tracking mirage, learning to see what the environment was telling me. There's no shortcut. You have to put in the time." She returned to her seat, the brief lesson finished. But something had shifted in the group dynamics. The trainees looked at her differently now, not with the casual dismissal of before, but with something approaching reverence. Thorne cleared his throat. "All right, for the remainder of the week, we're adjusting the training schedule. Those of you who missed the ghost shot this morning will get additional attempts. But before you shoot, you'll spend time with Lieutenant Hargrove, learning her method for reading environmental conditions." He looked at Evelyn. "If you're willing to share that knowledge, ma'am." Evelyn nodded once. "I'm willing." The next 3 days became a master class in precision shooting. Evelyn worked with the trainees individually and in small groups, teaching them to slow down, to observe, to understand that shooting at extreme distances was as much about patience and perception as it was about technology and mathematics. Briggs was her most attentive student. He arrived early each morning, stayed late each afternoon, absorbed every word she spoke. His shooting improved dramatically. By day 5, he successfully hit the ghost shot target on his 3rd attempt, a feat that earned him handshakes from the other trainees and a rare nod of approval from Thorne. But it was Wilson who surprised everyone. The young private, who had seemed overwhelmed by the course's demands, spent hours with Evelyn learning to read mirage. On day 6, he hit the target on his 2nd attempt, his celebration loud and genuine. "You taught me to see," he told Evelyn afterward, his voice thick with emotion. "I was looking at everything wrong before." Evelyn's response was characteristically brief. "You were looking, now you're observing. There's a difference." Thorne watched these interactions from a distance, seeing something he should have recognized from the beginning. Leadership wasn't about volume or authority or physical dominance. It was about competence, about earning respect through demonstrated mastery, about helping others become better versions of themselves. The woman he had dismissed as a political statement was proving to be one of the most effective instructors he had ever witnessed. On the evening of day 6, Thorne found Evelyn alone on the range, long after the other trainees had left. She was at the 1,800-meter line, her rifle set up, but she wasn't shooting. She was just sitting, watching the sun descend toward the western mountains, painting the desert in colors that didn't have names. He approached carefully, aware that he was intruding on a private moment. "Lieutenant," she looked up but didn't speak. Thorne sat down on the ground a few feet away, his knees protesting the movement. They sat in silence for a while, watching the light change, listening to the wind that never completely stopped in this place. "Can I ask you something?" Thorne finally said. "Yes, sir. That shot in Kabul, the one where Sergeant Reed was killed. What happened?" Evelyn was quiet for so long that Thorne thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were in an overwatch position. 4-story building. Marcus was my spotter. We'd been there for 36 hours tracking an insurgent cell that was planning an attack on a forward operating base." She paused, her hands unconsciously moving to clean a rifle that was already immaculate. "We had 7 confirmed kills over 2 days. Surgical. Clean. We thought we were invisible, but someone had spotted us, called in our position. The IED was placed in the stairwell below our position." Her voice remained steady, but her hands had stopped moving. "Marcus saw the wire first, told me to run, but there was nowhere to run to. We were 4 stories up. The only exit was through the stairwell where the device was placed." Thorne waited, not interrupting. "He threw himself between me and the blast, took most of the shrapnel. I took some, but he took most of it. I tried to stop the bleeding, tried to call for extraction, but we were pinned down. Enemy forces knew we were wounded, knew we couldn't move fast." She looked at her hands as if seeing blood that was no longer there. "I had to make a choice, try to save him, or eliminate the enemy forces closing on our position. If I tried to save him and they overran us, we both died. If I kept shooting, maybe extraction could reach us in time." "What did you do?" "I kept shooting. 6 more confirmed kills in the next 40 minutes, while I waited for the quick reaction force. Marcus bled out beside me while I was looking through my scope." The words hung in the desert air, heavy with a pain that time had done nothing to diminish. The QRF arrived, secured the position. I rode back to base with Marcus's body in the Humvee with me. 3 days later, they gave me a Bronze Star. Marcus got a flag and a burial plot. She finally looked at Thorne, her gray eyes bright with tears that didn't fall. "So when you ask me why I'm here, why I need this qualification, it's because I need to prove I can still do the job. That Marcus didn't die so I could walk away. That the shots I made that day, the choice I made, mattered for something." Thorne felt something break in his chest. A calcification of pride and certainty that had been there so long he'd forgotten it was a choice. "He would be proud of you," Thorne said quietly. "The Marine you've become, the instructor you are. You honor his memory by being excellent." "I hope so." They sat together as the sun completed its descent, and the desert turned from gold to purple to the deep blue of twilight. No more words were necessary. The silence between them had transformed from hostile to companionable. 2 professionals sharing the weight of decisions made under fire. Day 7 arrived with news that changed everything. General Webb called an emergency formation at 0600. The trainees assembled, confused and anxious, wondering what could warrant such an unusual gathering. Webb stood before them with an expression that revealed nothing. "Change of plans," he announced. "We've received a challenge from the Army Sniper School at Fort Moore. They claim Marine standards have dropped. They want to settle the question of who produces the better marksman." A murmur went through the formation. The rivalry between Marine and Army snipers was legendary, friendly but fierce, each service convinced of their own superiority. "They've proposed a competition," Webb continued. "One shooter from each service. Distance of 2,200 meters. First to hit wins bragging rights for the next year and a plaque that will hang in the winter schoolhouse." 2,200 meters, over 1.3 miles. Beyond the current Marine Corps record, beyond what most shooters considered possible with standard equipment. "The Army is sending their best," Webb said. Staff Sergeant Daniels, veteran of multiple deployments. Over 80 confirmed kills, their current course record holder. He paused, letting the information settle. We need to send our best to meet him. Lieutenant Hargrove stepped forward. Evelyn moved from the formation, her expression showing nothing. Webb looked at her for a long moment, then spoke words that carried the weight of institutional faith. Lieutenant, you are the best marksman I have ever observed. Your combat record speaks for itself. Your performance this week has been exemplary, but this shot is beyond anything you've attempted in training. It's at the edge of what's technically possible. He paused. I'm not ordering you to take this shot. I'm asking, will you represent the Marine Corps? Evelyn didn't hesitate. Yes, sir. The competition is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 0700. You'll have tonight to prepare. Range will be yours exclusively after 1600 today. Webb turned to Thorne. Gunnery Sergeant, you'll serve as her coach and support. Whatever she needs, you provide. Yes, sir. The formation was dismissed, but the energy on the range had transformed. What had been a training course was now something else, a crucible. A test not just of Evelyn's skill, but of everything the Marine Corps taught about precision, discipline, and rising to impossible challenges. The news spread across the base with the speed of wildfire. By afternoon, word had reached division. By evening, Marines from other units were asking permission to observe. The simple competition had become something larger than itself. A symbol, a statement about capability and standards, and the Marines who upheld them. Evelyn spent the afternoon in solitude, walking the range, studying the terrain at 2,200 meters, noting every rock formation, every change in elevation, every feature that would affect wind and bullet flight. She filled pages in her data book with observations and calculations, building a mental map of the environment she would have to master tomorrow. Thorne watched from a distance, understanding that this was her process, her way of preparing. He had offered to help, and she had quietly declined. This was work she had to do alone. As the sun began to set, Evelyn finally set up her rifle at the firing position. But she didn't load it. She simply settled into position behind it, looking through the scope at the target that had been placed at the extreme distance. So far away it was barely visible, even with magnification. Thorne approached, carrying 2 bottles of water. He set one beside her and sat down with the other. You don't have to do this, you know, he said. Webb gave you an out. No one would blame you for declining. I would, Evelyn said simply. Why? What does this prove? She was quiet for a moment, then spoke with more words than she had offered since the course began. When Marcus died, something in me broke. The certainty I had, the confidence that I could make the shot when it mattered. I came back from Kabul different, hesitant, second-guessing. That's death for a sniper. She adjusted her cheek weld slightly, her eye never leaving the scope. This qualification was supposed to prove I could still do it. But the ghost shot wasn't enough. It was too familiar, too close to distances I'd already mastered. I need something harder, something that pushes me past what I think is possible, something that proves I'm not broken. You're not broken, Thorne said with conviction. You're one of the most capable Marines I've ever met. The fact that I was too blind to see it doesn't change that truth. Evelyn finally looked away from her scope, meeting his eyes. Thank you, Gunny, but I need to prove it to myself. Tomorrow morning, when I'm behind that rifle, it won't be about Marines versus Army. It'll be about whether I can trust myself again, whether I can make the shot that matters. Thorne nodded slowly. He understood now, in a way he hadn't before, what drove her. The need to reclaim something that trauma had stolen. The necessity of testing herself against the impossible to prove that the possible was still within reach. Then let's make sure you're ready, he said. Walk me through your plan for tomorrow. They spent the next 3 hours together, instructor and student roles reversed, as Evelyn explained her strategy, the hold-off she would use, the atmospheric calculations, the way she would read the terrain. Thorne listened, asked questions, offered observations, and slowly came to understand that he was witnessing a level of mastery that came along perhaps once in a generation. When they finally left the range, the stars were brilliant overhead, the Milky Way a river of light across the darkness. Tomorrow would tell whether that mastery was enough. Morning came cold and still, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. By 0630, over 200 Marines had gathered around the range, perched on every available vantage point. Word had spread beyond the base. The competition had become an event. Staff Sergeant Daniels arrived with a small contingent from Fort Moore. He was 34, built like a linebacker, with the confident bearing of someone who had never met a challenge he couldn't overcome. His rifle was a custom build, state-of-the-art in every respect, with a scope that cost more than some used cars. He and Evelyn shook hands, the gesture professional but carrying the weight of institutional rivalry. "Good luck, Lieutenant," Daniel said. "May the best shooter win." "You too, Staff Sergeant." The rules were simple. Each shooter would get 3 attempts. Best hit won. In the event both missed all 3, or both hit, the shooter with the closest grouping would be declared the winner. A coin toss determined order. Daniels would shoot first. He took his time setting up, consulting his ballistic computer, conferring with his spotter, adjusting his equipment. The confidence radiated from him like heat. This was a man who believed victory was already his. His first shot broke clean. The sound echoed across the desert. Everyone watched through optics, waiting for the impact. Dust puff, 6 feet right, 3 feet high. Close, impressively close for such an extreme distance. But a miss was a miss. His second attempt, 5 minutes later, was even closer. 3 feet right, 1 foot high. The crowd murmured. He was walking the rounds in, getting closer with each attempt. One more adjustment might do it. His third shot was the best yet. The bullet struck the steel target, but on the extreme right edge. A hit, technically but barely. It would have wounded an enemy, not killed them. Still, it was on target, and that counted. Daniel stood, satisfied. He had hit the target on his final attempt. The pressure was now entirely on Evelyn. She moved to the firing line with the same quiet purposefulness she brought to everything. No hurry, no wasted motion. She set up her rifle, that worn M110, with its hash marks and custom modifications earned through years of use. She didn't consult a computer. She opened her data book, that leather-bound repository of accumulated knowledge. She held up her wind meter, watching the impeller, feeling the morning air. She looked at the distant target, then past it, reading signs that only she could see. 10 minutes passed. 15. The crowd grew restless. Some wondered if she was stalling, trying to wait for better conditions. But Thorne, standing beside her as her coach, understood. She was building a complete picture of the environment. Every variable, every factor that would affect the bullet's 3.8-second flight. She was doing what computers couldn't, synthesizing experience and instinct and observation into an understanding that was more art than science. Finally, she settled into position. Her breathing slowed. The world narrowed to the reticle and the target and the space between them. Thorne watched her, this lieutenant who had proven every assumption wrong, who had turned dismissal into a masterclass in competence. He found himself hoping, perhaps even praying, though he wasn't a religious man. The first shot broke. The recoil drove back. The spent casing ejected in a brass arc. And then silence. 3.8 seconds of waiting, of hoping, of collective breath held. Tink. The sound was distant but unmistakable. Through the spotting scopes, the impact was clear. Center mass, perfect. The crowd erupted. Marines cheered. Some threw their covers in the air. It was a release of tension that had been building since dawn. But Evelyn didn't celebrate. She remained in position, watching through her scope, confirming the hit, then beginning her post-shot ritual, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She had 2 more shots available, but she didn't take them. One was enough. One perfect shot that said everything that needed saying. Staff Sergeant Daniels approached, his expression showing respect that bordered on awe. "That was the best shooting I've ever seen, ma'am. It's an honor to lose to someone at your level." Evelyn stood and shook his hand. "You pushed me, made me better. Thank you for that." General Webb descended from the observation tower, and for the second time in a week, rendered a salute to Lieutenant Evelyn Hargrove. This time, the entire gathered formation followed his lead. Over 200 Marines saluting one small woman who had just rewritten the record books. When the hands dropped, Webb spoke, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent range. "New Marine Corps record, 2,212 meters. First shot hit, set by Lieutenant Evelyn Hargrove, who has proven beyond any doubt that the measure of a Marine is not their size or gender or appearance, but their skill, their discipline, and their unwavering commitment to excellence." He turned to address the crowd. "Let this day stand as a reminder. We judge people by their capabilities, not by our assumptions. We measure them by their actions, not by our biases. And we honor those who, through dedication and sacrifice, push the boundaries of what we believed possible." The crowd erupted again. This time, Evelyn allowed herself a small smile. Not of pride exactly, but of relief. The thing she came here to prove, to herself more than anyone else, had been proven. She could still make the shot, could still trust her skills, was not broken beyond repair by the trauma of Kabul and the loss of Marcus Reed. The celebration continued, but Evelyn quietly slipped away, returning to the range where she had made her record shot. She sat alone in the morning sun, her rifle across her lap, looking at the distant target that bore the mark of her bullet. Thorne found her there an hour later. "You're missing your own victory party," he said. "I know." He sat down beside her. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. For how I treated you, for what I assumed, for being too stubborn and blind to see what was right in front of me. You apologized already, Gunny. I know, but I needed to say it again. Needed you to know that I learned something from you. About competence, about humility, about the difference between confidence and arrogance." Evelyn nodded slowly. "We all have blind spots. The question is whether we're willing to acknowledge them when they're revealed." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the heat waves begin to rise as the day warmed. Finally, Evelyn spoke again. "What happens now, after this course ends?" Thorne considered the question. "Webb wants you to stay on as an instructor, help redesign the curriculum, bring some of your experience into the formal training program. And you? How would you feel about that?" "Honestly," Thorne allowed himself a slight smile, "terrified, because I'd have to confront my own inadequacy every day, but also grateful, because I'd learned more from you than I ever could on my own." Evelyn looked at him, measuring his sincerity, and found it genuine. "I'll consider it." The weeks that followed became the stuff of legend. The story of the ghost shot and the record at 2,200 meters spread through the military community and beyond. Evelyn's name appeared in professional journals, in training documents, in conversations among snipers who had never met her but knew her reputation. The range where she made her shots was unofficially renamed Hargrove's Ridge. The target at 2,200 meters was preserved, never to be repainted, bearing the mark of a bullet that had rewritten history. Evelyn accepted the position as an instructor. She worked alongside Thorne, and together they reformed the curriculum to emphasize not just technology, but observation. Not just calculation, but understanding. Not just strength, but precision. Female enrollment in sniper training increased by 300% over the next year. Young women across the military saw in Evelyn's story proof that capability mattered more than appearance, that dedication could overcome any obstacle, that excellence was gender neutral. Thorne became Evelyn's most devoted advocate. He told her story to every new class, not as a tale of his own humiliation, but as a lesson in the dangers of assumption and the necessity of recognizing competence in all its forms. He taught his students to judge people by their actions, to respect earned expertise, to understand that the quiet professional was often the most dangerous. Corporal Briggs, inspired by Evelyn's mentorship, went on to become one of the top-ranked snipers in the Marine Corps. He credited his success to learning to see rather than just look, to observe rather than just watch. On the one-year anniversary of her record shot, Evelyn stood at Hargroves Ridge with a small group of colleagues. They had placed a memorial plaque at the 2,200-meter line. It bore a simple inscription: "In memory of Sergeant Marcus Reed, USMC, killed in action, Kabul, Afghanistan. The shots we make honor those who made them possible." Evelyn stood before the plaque for a long time, her hand resting on the cold metal. Thorne stood nearby, respectful of her private moment. Finally, she turned to him. "He would have loved this story," she said quietly. "The underestimated shooter proving everyone wrong. The impossible shot made possible. The transformation of doubt into certainty." "He trained you well," Thorne said. "No, he believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. There's a difference." She looked back at the distant target, that small piece of steel that had changed everything. "That's what I try to give my students now. Not just technical knowledge, but belief. The understanding that they're capable of more than they imagine. That the only real limits are the ones we accept." They walked back in silence. Behind them, the target stood sentinel, a piece of steel that had become something more. A line drawn between assumption and truth. A monument to every warrior who was underestimated, who proved the doubters wrong not with words, but with precision. The desert night fell silent, stars appearing one by one like witnesses to what had transpired. Hargroves Ridge stood empty now, but the target at 2,200 meters bore its permanent mark, a testament to skill, discipline, and the dangerous assumptions that silence could shatter. The most powerful lessons, like the most perfect shots, required no explanation. Evelyn Hargrove had spoken. The Marine Corps had listened. And in barracks and classrooms across the world, her story would be told not as a tale of gender or diversity, but as the truth every warrior needed to hear. Competence has no size, no shape, no voice. It simply is. And when it speaks, the only sound is the inevitable ring of steel meeting lead across impossible distance. The sound of excellence, undeniable and pure.